Okay, let's begin again with a prayer. Father, we ask your blessing on the people who are suffering from the coronavirus, and we ask your protection from all of us learning to live lives of fear and not really know what's going on. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. What we dealt with last time was the rise of the Muslim community, and I'd like to continue on with that. Thanks to the huge abundance of water, which the Muslim community had not known. Remember, they were tribes that wandered through the Arab desert, and largely they weren't settled. They began to settle when they took over Damascus and stuff like that, but they remained largely these tribes, and in the desert they had no thing of water. But when they came into water, their cities became sites of unbelievable beauty and centers of learning and trade. And I'll give you four names that were big. One is Baghdad, which is, as you know, is in, can't think of the name of it right now, and Cordoba, which is in Spain, Fez, which is in Morocco, and Palermo, which is on the island of Sicily. And so these cities just became magnificent. And to this day, if you go visit like Cordoba, you can see the remnants of it. You can see the great fountains and rivers ran down streets. But the thing had to do with the abundance of water, and they made magnificent cities. They came to control all the trade on the Mediterranean. In fact, I think you know that one of the symbols of the Muslim community is the crescent moon, and for that symbolized to them the civilization that went around almost all of the Mediterranean. This is also the period when Islam began to divide into factions. If you watch the history of religions, any religion, like we in the Catholic tradition watched the first break came between the East and the West, and a complete disintegration occurred during the Reformation. But religions tend to divide up over a period of time. And at this time also, a very distinct Muslim culture began to develop. So that like today, it's a curious thing that when you travel, let's say if you're traveling in Israel, you will know very well whether you're in a Muslim or an Israeli area. And it's from the idea of the mosques where they will project the prayers during the day, and the idea of everything stopping at certain times when people do their prayers. There's a very distinct Muslim culture and a very distinct Muslim architecture. Great centers of learning began to develop, and they were the greatest in the entire world in the areas of medicine and philosophy. They discovered philosophy because when the Greek culture began to disintegrate, the texts and everything for the ancient Greek things were largely ignored by the early Christians, being considered as too pagan. If you remember, we talked about the great looting and destroying of libraries that took place in the early days of the freedom of the church. Much of this was preserved in Greece itself. And as the Muslims went into that area, they encountered all that, and they had a great background in medicine and philosophy, and a lot of this came from Greek learning that they had that the West had largely ignored. Mathematics was probably the pinnacle. To this day, in mathematics, the numbers that we use are actually letters in the Arabic alphabet. Before this standardization, every culture used letters from their own alphabet as numbers. And probably the only acquaintance I have with it, and I don't know whether others have this acquaintance, is in Roman numerals, where the number I is 1, the number 5 is V, the number 10 is X. But these are all letters out of the Roman alphabet, and they came to be used as numbers. But because of the great influence of the Muslims in the mathematics from Pythagoras and things that all came out of Greece, that when mathematics really began to develop and spread, the standardization was these Muslim letters, which are the alphabet, are the numbers that you and I know today. In 687, Pepin and his son, Charles Martel, took virtual control of Gaul. Now, Gaul is basically the area of France, not exactly, but basically that area. And in 732, they defeated the Moors who were invading France. The Moors, as you know, came across through Spain and now were coming into France. They were defeated there. And that stopped the Muslim advance in Europe. At that time, it looked as though the Muslims would take over all of Europe, but that stopped the Muslim advance in Europe. This marked a period of great growth at this time in England. Now, Charles Martel and his son are in, Charles Martel and his father, rather, Pepin, are in the area of France. But in England, they began to develop very powerfully in the church. In the year 664, the church in England fully accepted the authority of the Pope. Up till that time, missionaries had come into England and established a lot of small churches and things like that. And they were developed into dioceses and stuff, but they were very independent of the rest of the church. Not so in Ireland. In Ireland, when the people came in, most missionaries had actually been sent by the Pope himself, so that the missionaries in Ireland were much more attuned to Rome. This particular, what do I want to call it? The particular idea of this kind of independence of the English church will be one of the things used by Henry VIII at the time he breaks. He maintains the church was never supposed to be really under the Pope at all. And he will claim and found a church independent of Rome itself. One of the great minds came into history at this time. His name is Bede the Venerable, and he wrote a history of the church in England. And I mentioned we studied earlier, I forget his name, about a man who was considered the father of church history. And basically, up to him, all the stuff we mentioned, we get from him. Between him and Bede, we get basically everything from Bede, because Bede is looking at how the church is working outside of England as well. England at this time began to send missionaries to unconverted areas. The English church became very powerful. It was much more connected to Pope. And one of the things about the church, to the degree churches connect with the Pope, they tend to become more international. Like the churches tended to be natural. The Ukrainian Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Church, the Armenian Catholic Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, they tended to be very localized. But once they entered into this relationship with Rome, what happened is that the Rome center made them kind of international, so that like in town here, we have a Byzantine Catholic Church. In the area that my family's from in Canada, there are more Ukrainian Catholics than there are Latin Catholics. And they have lots of Ukrainian Catholic churches. One of the things that's funny about the city in which sits right beside the reservation, the city of Winnipeg, there is a city block in downtown Winnipeg, or there was when I was a youngster, on which 3 archbishops have their homes. And each one of them is actually in their own diocese. And it's the Ukrainian Catholic Archbishop, it's the Latin English Archbishop, and it's the French Catholic Archbishop, the 3 of them. And they're each in their own diocese, they're each Catholic, and they're all, on the same block. So what we see now is this church becomes more international. There was a man named Winifred, and for some reason he changed his name to Boniface. I know if I was Winifred, I'd change it to something. But he changed it to Boniface. He went on and converted Germany, and he's known as the the founder of the church in Germany. He was a very, very powerful man. One of the things that's interesting about the Germans actually worshipped trees. And I'm not quite sure how that worked. But anyway, the Germans were very much involved in the worship of trees. And from that point on, we notice a great influence of trees in the Catholic Church. I think one of the great things of the Roman Catholic Church is it is like a person that is able to put on the garb anywhere without changing the person. And so the two things that you would notice most, although we have lots of things in the Catholic Church, are number one, the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree comes out of Germany and becomes very much, a part of our tradition. And the next thing is like Christmas wreaths and uses of boughs of greenery, like for asperges, throwing holy water and stuff like that. All that stuff comes out of Germany, and it's because of the tree business. Boniface eventually was martyred in the year 753. He's most famous for one of the very first things he did. I told you the Germans worship trees. He went into an area and he began to preach, and what he did one day, he went over to the tree that the Germans worshipped and chopped it down. And the whole thing was like, if this is sacred, if this is God, it should be able to defend itself against a simple human being. And that was very powerful with him. Pepin, whom we mentioned before, is the head in France, fought for the Pope against the Lombards. The Lombards are a tribe that came out of the Germanic areas into northern Italy. And so in order to protect the Pope, these tribes were moving towards Rome. In order to protect the Pope, Pepin came into the area and defeated the Lombards. The thing that's most important about it is the territory he took from the Lombards became what we will call the Papal States. The Papal States eventually occupied the whole middle of Italy. And when the time came for Italy to be united, they needed to actually take those states. So the remnant of the Papal States are number one, Vatican City, but there are a few little pieces of it too, like Castel Gandolfo is actually papal property, the summer home for the Pope. And there are several churches in downtown Rome that actually sit on property that is still legally papal property. But for the most part, the Papal States are gone. In 774, a very important man came to control Italy. And Italy at this time was very Catholic and pretty well united. And the man's name was Charles the Great. Now we know him as Charlemagne. So Charlemagne came to power. One of the things that we will associate with Charlemagne for the things he does, we will associate it with what is called the Carolingian Renaissance. And he begins a remaking of his territories. And he's a very, very powerful man in the way he spreads out and works. But a huge amount of things in the church today actually date from that time. So Charlemagne went to Rome and met with the Pope. And curiously, they became very close friends. And they promised that they would give one another mutual support. The Pope would support him in his efforts to be a good ruler, and he would support the Pope in the efforts to unite and run the church. And they gave mutual support, they pledged to be friends, and they did this while praying at the tomb of St. Peter, which, as you know, is underneath St. Peter's Basilica. At the gates of the city of Rome, when Charlemagne came to Rome, he got off his horse and entered the city as a pilgrim. He did not enter the city as a head of state or something like that, but came in as a pilgrim. And this is what most impressed the Pope. The Pope was convinced that no matter how good a king, how good or bad he would be, This is very early in his reign. No matter how good or bad he would be, that he would be a devoted believer. So the Pope accepted him, that he accepted the papal authority in religion, and the Pope accepted his authority as the king. As Charlemagne went on, he never gave any of the lands he conquered in Italy to the Pope, but he clearly supported the Pope's views and religious views. He saw himself as the dominant political leader in Italy and saw the Pope the dominant religious leader in the world. Now, at this time, Italy was kind of divided up in little unimportant things, but they were things like there were the Papal States, which again was small. There were a lot of little duchies where they were ruled by a duke, and there was territory that belonged to the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. Charlemagne gradually became the dominant leader and took over these areas, and he clearly became the powerful thing. Again, he did not conquer the Papal States, but he conquered these other areas and left the states for the Pope. Charlemagne then conquered the Saxons. The Saxons were very important as history goes on, but they're a German tribe that comes from a little north of Bavaria. The leader of the Saxons decided to become a Catholic. When Charlemagne defeated him, he recognized the authority of God and became a Catholic. Charlemagne, incidentally, was his godfather at his baptism. However, any of the troops that did not choose to join the church were killed. And we will watch this go on a lot at this time. Charlemagne then felt empowered, and he marched into Muslim Spain. There, he was very seriously defeated, and his army fleeing Spain after the defeat was ambushed, and they were slaughtered. If you're familiar with the famous epic poem, The Song of Roland, the Song of Roland commemorates the slaughter of that army. He then went on to conquer Bavaria, and that king accepted baptism, and Charlemagne was his godfather. He must have had godchildren all over Europe. Anyway, again, we see this idea of imposing of the Catholic faith on people. One of the things you study historically is one of the best ways of uniting people is religion. People really die for God. So what you want to do is unite people in a religion and somehow unite that religion to your government. And in society, people get very antsy about other religions if they're united under one. In the history of India, for instance, initially Buddha was a Hindu. And when Buddha began to teach his own brand, now remember, he would be like an Indian guru. Well, there are gurus all over teaching. But when his teaching began to go, Buddhists were driven entirely out of India. And the word Hindu used to refer to anyone from India. It wasn't a religious term. But at that time, it became a religious term. And they were threatened by the Buddhists. Things have changed that way all over the world now. But the important thing is that people need to be united politically, that shouldn't interfere with religion. And people should be united religiously, and that shouldn't interfere with politics. One of the things that Pope John Paul is reported to have said when he died was that he was too Polish, because during his administration was very, very concerned with Poland and did many things in favor of Poland. And of course, he came out of Poland when it was being tormented and destroyed by the communists. So anyway, Charlemagne proved to be an excellent ruler. He met with people, he wrote very just laws, and judges were very carefully chosen. And once you became a judge, you served for life. I think you know that's true on the Supreme Court in the United States. It's believed that if a judge serves for life, that a judge is less likely to be influenced. Like a judge has to remain popular if he's going to be elected, as we do in the United States here. Judges come up for re-election. But he needs to remain popular. That will affect decisions he makes. Or a judge can be removed by a ruler or something, when he needs to be conscious of what the ruler wants. But the belief is that if you serve for life, and that's guaranteed, then you, in fact, will be very, very just. And I think there is some element to that, though it depends on the individual. Though he himself was largely uneducated, Charlemagne hugely valued education. He thought it was the most important thing in the world. And all of his officers, all of his administrators, all of his advisors, all of them, he chose highly educated people. He divided his land into archdioceses, okay? Remember, we have dioceses. Well, Charlemagne's actually the guy who started archdioceses. How does an archdiocese work? Well, when you found a diocese, as the diocese grows and becomes strong, the dioceses that are broken off from it are called dioceses, but the one they're broken off from is an archdiocese, okay? So it becomes an archdiocese as other dioceses are broken off. Each archdiocese was ruled by an archbishop, and he had to go to Rome to receive the pallium from the hands of the Pope. And at that, he had to personally pledge loyalty to the Pope. And then he received the pallium. He was officially an archbishop. And you realize that what he's doing is increasing the ties to Rome. I'll tell you, this thing of the archbishop, too, is true today. On the feast of St. Agnes, the Pope is given a lamb, presented a lamb, and that's because in Latin, the word for lamb is agnus, and it's so close to the word Agnes that they use the lamb as a symbol. That lamb is sheared, and from that lamb, they make a ribbon of wool. And that ribbon of wool is cut into pieces, and an archbishop will wear it around his neck and hanging down about this far. And it's the symbol of an archbishop. It's called the pallium, and you have to receive it from the Pope personally. Every archbishop does it. I happened to be in Rome shortly after the election of Pope Benedict. And if you ever get a chance to go to Rome after the election of a pope, don't. One of the things that happens is when a pope is appointed, a pope has to, after his appointment, take personal possession of those churches I told you that are part of the territory of the Pope, St. Mary Major, St. John Lateran, St. Paul's outside the walls. You have to take, so for weeks after a pope is anointed, what you will do is you'll find whole streets and everything cut off because there's caravans taking the pope to take legitimate possession of these individual churches. But the other thing that went on was if you were on a large tour at that time, you could be in very serious troubles. The conferral of the pallium takes place on the feast of Peter and Paul. And it's normally not a big deal because maybe 3 or 4 archbishops are appointed a year. There aren't a lot of archbishops appointed every year. And as a result of that, 3 or 4 come with their group of people. But Benedict was elected after John Paul wasn't functioning for many, many years. And as a result of that, there were archbishops everywhere when Benedict came to authority. On the Feast of Peter and Paul, they all came to Rome as they were required, and many hotels, on the day a tour arrived, canceled the tour, that they had no accommodations at all. That's because the hotels were filling with these archbishops and their entourage. It was, well, my accommodations were assured, so I found it amusing. But anyway, the other thing that went on at this period, this became known, as I mentioned, as the Carolingian Renaissance. One of the greatest works of this is the establishment of what was called the Palace School. Charlemagne established a school, the palace school. And up to this time, education was simply by someone who knew more than you did. And an example, like if you take the little schools that opened on the West Coast, that you wouldn't really, during the days of the miners and stuff like that, the only thing is it would normally be a woman, and she could read and write. So that's what she taught the kids, reading, writing, mathematics, and that was about it. But she wasn't, a teacher, this sort of thing. The palace school that Charlemagne established required the teachers be accredited and have a certain level of education. And what they did at that was standardize the alphabet. So just as the numbers come out of the Muslims, the letters in our alphabet, the way they're formed, come out of this palace school that Charlemagne established. He also established parish schools, and they were established throughout the kingdom. They were modeled on the palace school. Most of their teachers had been trained in the palace school. And he insisted instruction be in 2 languages. Before this, most people who went to school, their instruction was in Latin. But he insisted it be in Latin and the local language, which there was French. But he included it be in the 2 languages. The Abbey of Monte Cassino that had been established hundreds of years earlier by St. Benedict became, under Charlemagne, the model for all the abbeys and all the monasteries that developed in this area. So you notice what's going on now is Charlemagne is standardizing the church, but he's not ruling it at all, but he's standardizing it. So he picks the greatest monastery, which is Monte Cassino, and makes all monasteries model after that, and it goes through. And he will establish, because there wasn't like the best school, so he establishes the best school and then models all the others after that. In the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor, after the Roman nobles, who had been supported by the emperor, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They charged the Pope with a number of crimes and attempted to remove him. The prelate in Constantinople always wanted more authority because it was actually a more significant Catholic area than was Rome. And the emperor over there wanted the authority that the Pope was exercising in Rome. So if they could get rid of the Pope, the Byzantine emperor could take over all the political influence in the area, he thought, and the patriarch could take over the religious influence. Now, the Roman nobles saw the Pope always as a threat to them, and eventually they will have great control over the papacy, but not at this time. And so they attempt to remove him. But Charlemagne marched into the city of Rome with his army and defended and supported the Pope. The Byzantine emperor challenged Charlemagne with an army, but eventually they were able to work out a peace treaty. And the peace treaty left Charlemagne in the area of the West with the Pope and left the emperor in Byzantium or Constantinople with, in fact, the prelate over there. Charlemagne felt very secure in his position as emperor of the West, and so he designated his only surviving son, Louis, as his successor. This man, Louis, will come to be known in history as Louis the Pious. So Charlemagne appointed him, and in 814, Charlemagne died. His son, Louis, then becomes emperor. Louis was a very good man, a very sincere man, and very interested in the good of his kingdom. But he was a very poor ruler. And I think one of the things was that when he was ruling, he defaulted everything to his father Charlemagne and Charlemagne's memory and the way Charlemagne did things, rather than go through the consultation of the people, which is what Charlemagne did. And one of the main things that made Charlemagne great was Charlemagne's constant interaction with the people in his kingdom. His influence on the church, much like Charlemagne, was very significant. And over a period of time, he actually proved to have been much better and much more influential on the church than on the kingdom. And in essence, he continued this Carolingian Renaissance. He made a clear distinction between monks and priests. At this time, you wouldn't know whether your parish was run by monks or priests or anything, but there was a clear distinction. And monks were confined to monasteries. Again, remember, the monasteries had to come under this model of Monte Cassino. Up to this time, there were some monasteries that were very loosely organized. The monks would travel around and do all kinds of things and have, the monastery kind of their home. Much like you see today, a lot of monks out of monasteries are teaching all over the place and running parishes and stuff like that. But in the Monte Cassino model, you cannot spend the night outside the monastery. So like you could leave the monastery to do work, farming, whatever you wanted, but you had to go into the monastery at night. So he was forcing these people to follow the Benedictine rule. Priests, however, in parishes, were also required to live in small communities and pray together. From the very early days of the church, they've recognized there's a real problem with any person who lives alone. You don't have any, what do I call, a monitor on your craziness. And so people who live alone don't, I think we all know that, but people who live alone, that can be a serious problem. So his effort was to do this. I should mention today, there's a movement in the Catholic Church today called the Jesu Caritas. And many, many priests are members of it. I'm a member of it. But in the Jesu Caritas, there's a group of priests that I've been meeting with now for almost 45 years. And we get together once a month. We talk about what's going on in our lives and stuff like that. But this constitutes kind of a community. Today, many priests are very interactive with the people in their parish and their families they have dinners with and stuff like that. But you have to be very, very careful about one who becomes very isolated and alone. Early in church history, they made it illegal for people to be hermits. Like if you were a hermit, you had to live in a community of hermits. You had your own private little area, but you came together with a certain regularity. And so he required that priests pray together. Monks were restricted in their contact with the lay world outside the monastery. They weren't to have contact outside the monastery, and were restricted as well in having visitors who come into the monastery. He clearly understood the distinction, that there was a complete distinction between religious and secular life. And I'll tell you the distinction. It's in very simple terms, but it's a very complex issue. When a person goes into religious life, they are supposed to enter the religious life for their holiness. And they do things that are supposed to help them become a holier person more in tune with God and stuff like that. But their whole purpose there is their holiness. When a man becomes a priest, particularly a parish priest, when a man becomes a parish priest, his vocation is the holiness of his people. Vatican II is the first time that this has actually been dealt with in a theological way. And it basically says that for a diocesan priest, the path to holiness is found in his efforts to bring his congregation to holiness. So he tries to find ways and teachings to bring his congregation to holiness. But because he himself is a member of that congregation, he should come to holiness through that himself. So that becomes the distinction. This period continued the great Carolingian Renaissance, and in France, the great center of learning became the city of Lyon. One difficulty at this time was that the church in France now was beginning to come more and more under the influence of the French nobility. And I'll remind you again of why that was. That is because wealthy people tended to enter the seminaries at the time. And so the bishops tended to be of these wealthy families. And so their family oftentimes exercised an awful lot of control over the church. There was a noble member of the court of Louis, and his name was Walla. Walla was highly critical of the problems that were developing in the government, and he was forced out of the court by Louis. So Walla was forced to leave the court because he was questioning the things that were going on that were problems. And Louis, I don't think, wanted to deal with them. A lot of people have great difficulty dealing with negative things. So he went off, and what he decided to do was to become a monk. He became a monk. Louis finally decided to bring him back and began at that time a huge reform in the government. He brought Walla back out of the monastery, and Walla came into the community and began this great process of the reform of the government. Nobles not serving their people were simply removed. Their titles and everything were taken. And the influence of the nobles on the church was actually broken. Walla did that. It's interesting, he was concerned about the corruption, but when he went in and became a monk and became more involved with the church, when he came out, he seems actually to be more concerned at the nobles corrupting the church than the corruption in the nobility itself. But as a result, the nobles were moved. The church and the nobles at this point again began to operate very independently. Louis Louis was sincerely interested in the good church, but again proved to be a poor, a poor ruler. Louis considered the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, as his private property, and he divided it among 3 sons. This is really a good example of what I'm talking about with regards to Louis in being a very poor ruler. So he decided to divide it among his 3 sons. And then the more he thought about it, the more he looked at it, he realized that what was going on as far as the union of the church and everything was largely due to the fact it was all under one kingdom, under this thing. So he changed his mind and decided to give the kingdom to his son Pepin. The other sons revolted, and they defeated Louis, and Louis was forced to enter a monastery. Then Pepin joined Louis, and they revolted against the other sons, but both Pepin and Louis perished in the battle. The kingdom was divided into thirds, and a treaty accepting the fact brought about peace. And this treaty was signed in the city of Verdun. A whole new Europe began to emerge. So with this division, the system, they had a lot of little things that were united under Charlemagne. Now this is divided into 3 large blocks. And then the Europe that we knew under Charlemagne begins to disintegrate, and a new view of Europe begins to rise again. I'm going now back to the Muslims. In the Muslims who ruled Spain for Cordoba were ruled over by a Muslim with the title caliph, and they call their territories caliphates, okay? And there, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in peace. I mentioned earlier that until the Crusades came up, the Muslims in general were benevolent towards Christians and Jews. There were times when it's been really bad, but that's usually with individuals. I would say something like, if you were to look at the area of Iraq, the major university in Iraq was called the University of Baghdad. It was a Jesuit university until Saddam Hussein came in. But that you would find that these areas, the acceptance of Christians and Jews, largely educated Christians and Jews, was very, very powerful and helped to build these societies. And they lived there in peace, and an extremely vibrant culture began to develop. Many important Jews from all over the world began to move to Spain. They were extremely well educated, and most of the important works of medieval Jewish culture were composed at this time in Spain. So medieval culture for the Jews is centered at this time in Spain. Cordoba became a center of culture, the most important in Europe for hundreds of years. They had a huge library in the city, and it became an international center of learning. Anyone with any future in education had something to do there. They built a huge mosque in the city that incorporated an entirely new way of building. It was an entirely new architecture. And it so influenced that after this point, we will watch that these great libraries, great mosques that are built at other places in the world beyond this point will always copy this to one way or another. It's really hard to describe. It still exists. And if you go to the city of Cordoba, you will be taken to see this mosque. It's one of the tourist attractions. It is absolutely massive. It's endless arches going in every direction inside. When you go in, it's bigger than any football stadium I've ever been in. And it's just like a forest of columns in every direction. It's just absolutely beautiful. There's a section cut out, and the section cut out holds a Roman Catholic cathedral that seats over 1,000 people. When you enter the mosque, you can't even see the cathedral, and it's in there among all the stuff. And it's a massive thing. They did it when the Ferdinand and Isabella were reconquering Spain. They had that built, that's to be a Catholic church, but it's hardly noticeable inside of the thing. So what we see is this huge rise of Muslim culture. At this time, we'll also see medicine becomes very important, education again from the Muslims here, and we'll move in. I'm going to stop it at this point, but I'd like to mention one thing here. When you look historically, you will discover that societies that can avoid the religious conflict become extremely important and powerful societies culturally. And you'll watch that go on in Spain under the Muslims. For a while, it went on in Muslim areas in Arabia. It has gone on in Italy at points like Venice became a great center of learning everything at one time. It happened, as I mentioned, in certain areas of Spain. But I would say right now, you would see a great flowering of culture and everything. And you see, not just learning is good, but a big flowering of culture you would find in New York City, for instance. And in New York City, if you go there, you realize there isn't the religious distinctions of things. And it's a great center for art and theater and culture and all that sort of stuff. But one of the keys to a vibrant culture is to actually accept different religions in their own way. I've often said that I believe that I would hope one day to live in a country where it would be more important that people believed than what they believed. Faith is a very, very powerful thing. And I think people who have great faith in any tradition will arise in the presence of God if they seek that faith. And when you go around to great centers and you find very holy people in traditions, like, for instance, the Pope, or I would say Thomas Merton was an example, the Dalai Lama is an example. When you find this really holy people in any tradition, you find out they're comfortable with every other tradition. And that's because as we experience God, it becomes a powerful thing, rather than fighting someone to get them into our tradition to somehow come into the relationship with God. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.